Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. I had troubles logging in. So how's everybody feeling today? Maybe you just want to post something up in the chat. Tell me how you're feeling today. And if you could, it's today's topic's all about teamwork and communication. So also, if you could put in the chat, how big is your team? The team that you normally work with, usual sort of work. How many people roughly in that team? Is it just a team of 1 or 2? Or maybe it's a team of 10, or it kind of varies. Maybe it's between 5 and 15. Sam works in a team of 3. Busy morning for Joe. Vaccinating HPV vaccines. Oh, yeah. My son used it as a good excuse to skip swimming that day because his arm was a bit sore. Julie's good. Team changes, at least 3 or 4, usually more if you include nurses and physios. Oh, your baby's just waking up. Okay, don't worry about that. Okay, so as I said, we'll get started on the topic, which is teamwork and communication. This is quite actually an interesting area if you delve into it a bit further. Today, we're going to explain how individual behavior and team dynamics can make care safer or less safe in health. We're going to explore a bit about using structured communication techniques to improve communication. And we're going to specify possible interventions to improve patient safety and reduce risk during times of transition. So there's going to be a bit of a lecture, and then we're going to do some discussion along the way, and there's a video at the end to watch and then discuss. So why is teamwork important? Well, as we probably know, a team is a group of people who work together. So you really can't have a team of 1. It's got to be 2 people or more, because it's about people having to communicate with each other to share ideas and coordinate and collaborate, achieving a common goal. And quite often in healthcare, there is never one person that can provide all the expertise needed for a patient, and it's not limited to just clinical expertise. There's other types of expertise that we need when caring for patients, like administration, cleaners around the bedside, really important with infection control, for example. So healthcare teams can help or hinder safety depending on how effective they are. And as teams are made up of humans, it's about human interaction more than anything else. And the majority of human interaction is in communication. We don't get anyone else to do anything without communicating it. So, of course, most of the problems are going to occur with that transaction, which is communication. Okay, and for example, when wrong site surgeries occur, there's usually someone who could have prevented it but didn't speak up, for example. So strong teams are teams that take these actions. They plan ahead, they reflect back and learn, they manage risk by thinking about the possible consequences and then thinking about what we can do to reduce the chance of those consequences happening. And they communicate early to give time for those risks to be mitigated or avoided. So as an individual within a team, the only way to be effective is to speak up, is to communicate. But it's easier said than done. So here's a question for you guys. We talk a lot about culture of safety. We need a culture of safety. We need safety conscious people. Patient safety is the #1 priority in this organization. What do we mean by a culture of safety? You know, what are the features? If I was to walk into a hospital, what would a culture of safety look like? You can either contribute on the chat or you can unmute yourselves and give us some ideas. Julie says, anyone is empowered to speak up if they have concerns and listen to. Yep, that's a great feature of a culture of safety. So people can speak up without being told not to. Sam says, again, empowerment to speak up, open disclosure and transparency. Yeah. Claire says, respect. Very good. Yeah. Excellent. So you got quite a few there. People treat each other with respect. So you're encouraged to speak up and people are not unfairly blamed. So criticism is preferably constructive, should be constructive all the time. And if it's actually not constructive criticism, i.e. it's punitive, then it needs to be done in a very careful way, not as to create more harm than good. The harm that could be caused by punitive actions is that you change the behavior of the person who has been punished in a way that actually makes them less effective and therefore brings out risks in other areas potentially. Or you lose that individual from the organization altogether, and then you have the problems with a gap in the roster, which is also a patient safety issue. So it's something that needs to be carefully handled. In a culture of safety, it is safe to talk about mistakes and errors. So when people speak up, people are listened to, and people are thanked for their contribution. Each team member understands that his or her actions contribute to safety or the lack of safety. So if you don't know why you are speaking up, or you think that what you say doesn't get heard, or that it gets heard but nothing gets done, then in the future you're not going to speak up. And I think that last point is something that really is very difficult in any organization, and probably particularly in this one, is that there does seem to be a perception, real to some extent, is that nothing happens, regardless of whether you make the effort to speak up. And speaking up is always costly. It always costs you some sort of reputational risk. So if there's no benefit on the other side to balance that out, then that's where the barriers to speaking up come in. So to expand a bit more on the psychological safety idea, where people are treated with respect, it's about people who can ask questions without looking stupid. So there is no stupid question is a good way of characterizing that on the stupid answers, really. Anyone can ask for feedback without looking incompetent. Again, this sort of idea that, oh, I might look stupid if I say this thing because it reveals that I don't know anything about this area. Anyone can be respectfully critical without appearing negative, and anyone can suggest innovative ideas without being perceived as disruptive. So out of these 5 types of negotiation, what do you think healthcare teams should try to use? Avoidance, accommodation, competition, compromise, collaboration? Well, obviously collaboration. But it is funny because in healthcare, probably more so in the UK, competition is built into the whole system. So when it comes to one hospital next to another hospital where their catchment areas perhaps overlap, the budgets that are given to those hospitals depend on the number of patients they see, and therefore they're competing over the same patients. Therefore, they're in direct competition with each other to win over the patient and therefore the money that comes along with that patient. And if you get competition set up at a sort of high budget level, that sort of competition in one way or another creeps down to the front line. Another area of competition within an organization would be for budgets, for example. There's a finite pot of money and you want to do so many open heart surgeries, but you also want to do so many joint replacements. You know, who gets to decide where the money goes? That's direct competition because unfortunately there is a finite pot of money each year anyway, until the budget is reset. So yeah, interesting. But collaboration is how we should be trying to move forwards. And who leads at your hospital? Sorry, going on to the topic of leadership. So who leads? And there are some obvious answers and there are some not so obvious answers. So who do you think is a leader in your, or in the hospital, in the organization, in your area, in your team? So for example, I mean, you could say, oh, well, the chief executive or now the district director is our organizational leader. And that's true. Ultimately, he is responsible for the organizational ship or tanker not crashing onto the rocks. And if he does, he is actually held personally responsible for ultimately for those failures. But he can't lead clinical situations. You know, he's not a doctor, and he's not working on the front line. So he's not a leader in every situation that we have in the hospital, far from it. So we have leaders everywhere in the hospital leading their own things. So you could say, oh, well, the consultant is the leader of clinical team, and that's correct, but the consultant's not always in the hospital. So who leads when they're not there? So there are many theories about leadership and lots of different models. And one that probably dominates in healthcare is called distributed leadership. And this is the idea that there's never just one leader, but there's a number of people in a certain team who can be leaders at different times or be leaders in their fields and not in other things. So a very clinical example would be if there is an arrest call. So somebody has a cardiac arrest and you get usually about 10 to 12 people around the bedside. And there needs to be one person leading the resuscitation. So that's often delegated to someone like the medical registrar or somebody who will then step back and try and orchestrate the team as they go about cardiopulmonary resuscitation and giving drugs and things like that. But there are other things that happen as well around a resuscitation event, such as maybe relatives who are standing nearby who need to be ushered out the way in a sort of compassionate way and dealt with. Who leads that? So sometimes actually it's best that the consultant who say if the consultant's turned up and it's their patient, whilst the arrest is running, there's a protocol, and usually consultants don't come to arrest. So actually they're probably not a great leader in the arrest situation, but they're actually probably pretty good to look after the patient's relatives, maybe get some information from them, and also maybe start to think about what might happen if the resuscitation is not going well. So they can sort of lead that side of things. You'll have nurses attending the resuscitation, and they're much better at leading the administration of drugs and fluids than the doctors, for example, because actually the nurses do that all the time. And they're much more efficient at doing that than the doctors would be. So even within a situation where there's a clear leader, there's a model of distributed leadership going on. And so leaders are not necessarily identified by position or rank, as I've been trying to show you. They exist at all levels. And strong leaders are people who promote a culture of safety. So they support people having psychological safety, being respected. They positively encourage open communication. They help stop negative criticism or unconstructive criticism in a compassionate way that brings everybody together rather than just pushing people apart and dividing. And they invite everyone into the conversation. So they look out for the people who are maybe holding back and try and pull them in. Planning ahead and reflecting back. So, I mean, we all know this, but it's very, time is always the thing that eats into these activities. Briefing, we tend to do that. Certainly before a theatre session, that's a common culture now. It didn't used to be. Debriefings is something that doesn't happen very well, I would say, most of the time. It may happen after a particularly traumatic adverse event on the ward or cardiac arrest, etc. And when it does happen, I think we talked about it before, it's actually very, very useful indeed. In critical moments, you can actually be consciously aware of the language you're using in order to improve the communication. And this is where a bit of skill and practice actually comes in. So there's the idea of how to speak up to somebody senior in a way that you can get them to do what you think is important if they're not really paying attention to you. So there's a sort of a ladder of escalation that you can use to try and get attention. First might be a hint, and the hint might be, handing somebody a piece of equipment and saying, do you think you need this? If you've noticed that they've not actually done that thing yet, for example. And if it's pushed away, then the next thing is that you may sort of say, you need to start and say, I need a little clarity, or I am concerned, or I feel scared about this situation. So you're using quite clear language to voice your concerns. And if that still doesn't work, then you need to actually give a directive to the person that you're trying to communicate with. So you need to say something like to them like, I need you to stop and listen to me. This is important. I need you to stop what you're doing right now because I'm not happy with it. So that would be the next level up. So the first one's a hint. The second one is voicing your concerns clearly, and the third one is a directive. And that's the sort of escalator that you can use in a critical situation to get somebody's attention. There's also the S-bar thing. So it's been widely used, and it's not something we're going to go over a huge amount here because I think it's done to death, to be honest, a bit. And it's a very useful tool to use in a situation where there is quite a lot at stake, usually a clinical situation, and you want to get a response. And so you briefly outline the situation. I'm calling from this ward. This person is sick and I am concerned. And that sort of headline thing kind of gets the attention of who you're speaking to before you go into the long background that could be a bit sort of convoluted and may lose the person's sort of attention. And then you go on to your assessment of the situation. I think this is I think X, Y, and Z is happening. And then the last bit is probably the most important. And you need to say, I want you to. You need to sort of like be quite directive. You need to say, I need you to, or I want you to do this. I want you to come in and see the patient. I want you to tell me what to do. I want you to phone the relatives and ask them about X, Y, and Z. It's something that's trained, but often isn't still not used very well. And then readback is about closed loop communication. So in an ideal communication setting, if that situation, that the example I just said with the S-bar communication, the person on the other end receiving would say, okay, let me just recap. You've got X, Y, and Z. You're worried about this and you want me to do this. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Is that okay? And then the other person confirms, yes, that is understood. And that's called closed loop communication. It's something that's come out of places like the Army and aeronautical industry. And it helps, it really helps stop misunderstanding or stuff lost in translation. It helps the person who's asking for the information to double check that everything has got through in the way that they meant it. This is a communication tool about patients being able to communicate with their relatives. It's an Ask Me 3 tool. To be honest, I don't think this has really taken much traction across the world. I think the more needs to be done to empower patients and relatives to speak up rather than just giving them some advice on how to sort of ask or about what questions to ask when they're in hospital. We have a project at the moment called Korero Mai, which is looking at all the barriers and things like that to patients speaking up, and there's quite some really interesting results that will come from that. So what percentage of adverse events are due to faulty transitions? So miscommunication when responsibility for a patient is transferred between providers and or locations account for what percent of adverse events in healthcare? So have a guess. Sam says 80%. Joe says 50%. Claire, 70%. Well, yes, Sam, if in doubt, use the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. It probably answers almost everything. You're right. It's 80% in here anyway. And the common challenges through these faulty transitions are adverse drug events, lost test results, incomplete referrals. Yeah. Here's another example. So medication reconciliation. This is a huge thing that happens in healthcare. So everybody who comes into hospital is on medication, and we need to make sure that what they're taking at home is what's recorded when they come in, and it's not necessarily the same as what's on their prescription or on their GP records, or even on the pills boxes that they bring in with them. So it's a bit of a task is to verify, usually directly with the patient in conjunction with referring to those notes, to see what is they actually taking, and then recording that clearly on our administration charts and confirming it makes sense. And then reconciliation is that at the end of their stay in hospital or at the end of any healthcare episode, it could be outpatient, that any changes are documented and communicated back to the patient as well as to all the relevant organizations. You'll see that this is the process kind of put out in basic terms, and it doesn't, even here, it doesn't look that basic. PCP stands for GP, primary care practitioner, GP. So they order a referral. This is in terms of closing the loop. If the GP orders a referral, it goes to the specialist reviews it and authorizes it, an appointment is scheduled, the consult occurs. Specialist communicates the plan to the patient, then they also communicate it to the GP, and then the GP accepts the knowledge of receipt of the plan and then communicates the plan to the patient and family and executes it. So this is another process, quite like the medicines reconciliation, where there's a lot of people involved before it all gets back to the start again. So it's no wonder that referrals get lost, plans get misunderstood along the way, plans don't get executed, or simply that by the time it all gets around to the beginning, the patients change their ideas about what should be happening and they don't want to follow the plan that was all set up. So this is a good example of just how complicated our processes are. So how can we improve? Well, electronic medical records help quite a bit. Pill monitoring technology, text message alerts, patient portals, all these IT solutions can help a bit, especially when you're dealing with larger and larger populations. And then when it comes to communicating with patients, speaking slowly, using clear, simple words, and using read back and ask me three. So that's a bit of an overview about teamwork and communication. This video is an excellent video. It's only 2 minutes long, but yet it really highlights the impact of disruptive behavior within a team that can directly lead to patient safety issues. So I'm just going to make sure the settings are correct.
I worked for a very senior, eminent surgeon who had a ferocious reputation. He did not want to be challenged. He insisted on being telephoned about every prescription that his patients were given, even the ones that I felt confident to prescribe, and then he would constantly find fault with the prescription. I ended up administering medication to a patient without recording the prescription, and patient came to harm as a result of that, because the other doctors looking after the patient didn't know the medication had been given. When I sat down and talked with some of the other doctors, they had also administered medication without recording it appropriately, because we were all afraid to go to the boss and say this is what we thought the patient should have. So as a result, the patient suffered side effects from the drugs that we had given. There was no record of what we had done. There were interactions between the drugs, and obviously, I felt terrible about that. Thankfully, the patient recovered. I just accepted that this was the way it was, and I didn't know. I would certainly have been afraid to challenge him directly. People who are on the receiving end of this treatment on the ground don't have to accept it. It's no longer acceptable in medicine that we just tolerate this and we regard it as part of the culture of medicine. We need to say this is not the way we want to behave. This is not the way we want to train people to behave in the future, and it's dangerous for patients. It's not a personal choice not to tolerate. It's a professional responsibility to raise this as an issue, no matter how difficult it is. And that doesn't mean raising it directly with the perpetrator, but that means raising it with somebody who's in a supervisory role, a clinical supervisor or somebody from the medical school or somebody else. For too long we have tolerated people whose behaviour has been disruptive or unprofessional because they're technically good at their job. They're good surgeons, they can do the operation well, they're good physicians, they can prescribe well or they can diagnose well. You've got to do both. You have to be a good clinician and you have to be a good professional as well.
Great. So we're going to open up some discussion. If you feel free to unmute yourself. Now, why do you think healthcare professionals may behave disrespectfully towards their colleagues?
Well, it's obviously a high stress environment, and people are tired, and both of those things don't tend to bring out the best in people when they're tired and stressed.
Yep. So that is an explanation sometimes. Why do you think some healthcare professionals are worse than others?
Well, that's probably, yeah. I mean, you'd be absolutely right. It affects everyone, but I guess some people are able or willing is probably the two aspects of that, either able or willing to regulate that and to, not just act on those first impulses. And I guess, yeah, able and willing is the trick.
Yeah. Claire's offered another thing, competition. So I think what you mean is healthcare professionals trying to be better than their peers, for example, and therefore, therefore going sort of overboard in their search for perfection, would I say? I think that's certainly a culture that is selected within certainly within medicine, because there's a huge amount of competition to get in the door to begin with into med school, then I think there's this idea that the doctor knows best that pervades the fraternity of medicine even till today. So you kind of have to sometimes blag it, or not you have to, but sometimes people will pretend to themselves that they know everything about a situation and are less willing to sort of admit that they don't know everything. They maybe see that as a weakness if they admit that they don't know everything. Shree says overconfident at times. Yeah, so I think the overconfidence actually comes from a place of underconfidence to begin with, to be honest. It's overcompensating for deficiencies that you may perceive you have. I would say that ultimately disrespectful behavior from colleagues towards another comes down to sort of underlying values as well. If you yourself value sort of success over the way you are perceived by other people, then you're going to not care so much about how your communication comes across to other people, and more likely to brazenly bash through other people's feelings and cause that amount of emotional trauma to your teammates. So I think to a large extent there is some selection of certain individuals into professions with these traits, and I think more recently we know that, and we're trying to select different people into medical schools. Let's pretend. Let's go to the last one. Pretend you are working for this boss, or if you can't identify with a clinical situation, pretend that you're working for in your admin area under a supervisor who is also very micromanaging, critical about everything, and that criticism comes in an unconstructive manner, which actually inhibits your work. What steps would you take to address the situation, or what advice would you give to that doctor we just saw in the video? Okay, well, I'll maybe offer what might happen in Sam, you wanted to speak there, I can see.
Oh, no, none of you jump in. I mean, back in a previous life, I used to work in the disability sector a lot, and this might be wildly inappropriate to use, but when we were dealing with behaviour stuff, it was usually a huge part of it is usually waiting to deal with it. So if you try and deal with it in the heat of the moment, it can escalate the situation, because if you then respond in an aggressive fashion, then that person may respond in a more aggressive fashion. And usually what we'll do is oh yeah, and I think Sarie's actually saying what I'm about to say more elegantly. Yeah, you talk to them after things have calmed down, and and then you usually get a better reaction, because even when it's not in the heat of the moment, you can hopefully get them to reflect a bit more on just even saying stuff like, do you think that was the best way to deal with that situation, or being focused on the outcome. Did that get the outcome we're wanting? And I think a lot of people, when they're not in the heat of the moment, have to admit that yelling at people doesn't get the best outcome for the patient or themselves. But I think Sari probably said that better than I could.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. It's usually better to deal with emotive situations like that in the cold light of day, rather than during the time when emotions run high on both sides. Yeah, Sari said, start with, if a one-to-one talk has failed, I would send an email. Actually, I would probably not. My approach to sort of difficult conversations is to keep them as conversations. And that's because if you find a conversation difficult, I guarantee you an email conversation is twice as difficult. And the reason that is because you lose that at least 30% amount of nonverbal communication that comes across. So, for example, the same sentence that you say in an email doesn't have the inflections or the tone of voice or your expressions on your face, whether you're angry or you're trying to lighten it up a bit. And so the reader of an email will tend to paint their own picture in the mind of the face that's coming at them through the email. And so if it's a negative feedback, then they're usually going to tend towards the worst possible looking face saying this thing to them. So that's why email negative feedback can actually come across harsher than it's actually intended, and it can actually cause a bit of a spiral. So I tend to want to have difficult conversations as verbal things. So yeah, obviously I think the first thing is to approach the person directly yourself, because you can often make a difference that way. So for example, going up to the person, there are ways in which you can do it without escalating the situation. Obviously wait, as Sam says, and then the second thing is to start with absolute cold hard facts, not analysis or any sort of interpretation of what those facts mean. So good sentences to start off with the factual thing is like, well, first of all, you have to ask permission. You say, can I talk to you about something difficult? Or is it okay if I spend 5 minutes? I wanted to talk about that situation. Or even better, to give a bit of notice, say, is it okay if we sit down next week to talk about something that happened recently? Once you're into that conversation, you start off with the facts and you say, last week I noticed that you said this to me. And then you talk about the impact that had on you. So you would say something like, that made me feel angry, that made me feel sad, that made me feel scared. These are all facts that the other person cannot sort of argue with you on, because they're utter facts. The fact that they said that is a fact. The fact that you feel like that, they can't argue how you feel. How you feel is how you feel. So by doing that, you actually are giving them data to process, rather than giving them accusations to defend. Once you say, oh, this made me feel like such and such and such and such, then you talk about another fact, which is the effect of how you feel on, what was the impact? As a result, I feel very inhibited to come to you about other important issues. Again, another fact that they can't change. And then the last thing you do is say, what is your take on this situation? So then none of that is accusation. That the last step is actually asking them to offer their side of the story. And that can actually escalate things down to a discussion about the facts. And then you might find that there's actually some misinterpretation going on, which has escalated the situation. And then you can actually establish the facts together of the situation before then understanding what the way forward is. So that is one sort of way to have a difficult conversation with somebody. It's actually a framework that I learned a while back, and it's got a name, but I've completely forgotten it now. But obviously sometimes that's too difficult to have if the person that you're having a discussion with has got too much control over you. And then I think the conversation then needs to be had with someone else, like that guy said. Again, if you want to, I think if you're at the stage of writing something down, I would probably write it down again, trying to stick to all the facts, and then send that to a supervisor. And I would avoid actually communicating directly written. Joe said I would have a conversation in private with the person directly. I'd also discuss the situation with the clinical supervisor. Yeah, just as we said. That kind of brings us to the end of the discussion of the video. And I just wanted to find out if there are any other sort of questions around that teamwork or dealing with difficult conversations that anybody had?
Oh, sorry, I just want to say, because I know people have said competition being an issue, and I thought it was quite interesting. I was listening to I think it was a podcast, and there was some economist tried to do a study in an American ED, and being an economist, he thought he'd go in there, and what he'd do is he'd look at the relative performance of the ED, and then look at the clinicians that were on duty at that time and see if there's any correlation on various measures. And what was quite interesting, and to be fair, this is America, which is more litigious, he got extreme pushback. And the clinician said, no, that's completely unreasonable. By all means, judge the patients under my care, my performance of the patients under my care, but you can't judge the wider ED, because that includes patients that aren't under my care, and I'm not responsible for that. Which I thought was interesting, because and the chap said, he totally backed down and did a new study. But yeah, that just triggered an interesting thing about the training there, where in one sense that's true. In another sense, though, everything they do is going to impact on how the wider ED runs. Every decision they make. So that idea that seems to be in some professions, that you're only responsible for the people under your direct care, and it's not your responsibility how the wider service or the wider environment runs, despite clearly having influence. Yeah, I don't know. That just struck a bit of a chord. So when people say competition, it made me think of that.
Yeah. That idea of doctors only being responsible for the patients that they treat is quite an old-fashioned one. It comes, from the model of care where, a doctor and a patient had a singular relationship with each other. And when you bring that old-fashioned idea into a modern, large healthcare system, it doesn't work, because there's obviously finite resources that everybody is competing for. And if you're only protecting your own patients, then you're actually competing against other clinicians and stuff for resources for your own patients. And you think, okay, as long as my patients are adequately resourced and treated, then I'm happy with that. That's my duty dispersed. But you don't think about the harm that's created to patients outside that bubble, because you've managed to leech some of the resource that's been taken away from other people, for example. So I think more and more we are understanding that as doctors, we have a duty. We have actually two hats to wear. We have a hat when we are in doctor-patient mode and we're advocating for a single patient. But then stepping back from that, we also have a role to advocate for a population that we serve, and to understand that we need to kind of find a good happy medium that doesn't adversely affect other people that are not in our direct care. And that's why it is really important to have clinical leadership throughout an organization, going all the way from the bottom to the top, as well as managers. So we have basically a mixed model of leadership in an organization, where you have both non-clinical and clinical staff leading an organization to deliver the best healthcare for a population. Of course, achieving that is difficult. To get it right is really difficult. Okay, great. Well, that brings us to the end, and I hope you have a great lunch, and thank you very much. See you next time.